Okay, as soon as it lets me out of the recording screen, we'll be on our way. Okay, I'm not at all sure why I'm frozen. Okay. How are we doing? Looks like I have fiber, so I don't know what that was about, but let's try that again. Okay, this is looking more promising.
Now we see it, Emma.
Awesome. Great. And do you see the right version? Do you see a full screen or do you see the presenter screen?
Presenters.
Full.
It's a full
Great.
screen.
Excellent. That's what I like to hear. You never know, honestly. It's a guess every time I do this. Okay. Rolling here. I am Emma Hanson. I am the Wood Energy Coordinator at the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Rec. And we're going to cover a lot of ground and cover all of your burning questions. So we're going to talk about what advanced wood heat is, why it's awesome, how it can make sense for you, and whether or not it's going to make financial sense for you. So advanced wood heat, what does that mean exactly? So humans have been heating with wood forever, give or take 100 years, but we've only just gotten really good at it here in the past 30. So when we talk about advanced wood heat, what we're referring to are really highly efficient wood burning appliances that range in scale from anything from a brand new EPA certified wood stove on the low end, all the way up to a very large scale wood chip system. And we'll take a look at what those look like. So advanced wood heat covers a wide variety of volumes and scale, but they're all really highly efficient and well-engineered products. And automated wood heat is advanced wood heat that can be programmed with a thermostat. So something like a pellet boiler. So all automated wood heat is advanced, but not all advanced wood heat is automated. So when you see AWH as an abbreviation, what we're referring to is advanced wood heat. I just want to clear this up right off the bat in case there's any lingering confusion, because this happens all the time and it's super understandable. But advanced wood heat is not synonymous with biomass electric. Unfortunately, biomass electric and wood heat share an awful lot of nouns, like trees and energy and pellets. So it's really, really reasonable for a layperson to not realize that these two things are really different. And there's a lot of negative press out there and a lot of negative coverage about biomass electric, but it has absolutely nothing to do with advanced heat. So I just want to clear that up right out of the get-go. They have really different environmental and greenhouse gas impacts. So two different things. Please help me spread the word. Okay. So the reason I specifically work for the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, as opposed to some other relevant branch of government like Public Service Department or Commerce and Community Development, is it's forest health. So this is where the Department of Forest, Parks, and Rec has skin in the game of advanced wood heat. Vermont is 76% forested, and 80% of that forested land is privately owned. And currently, we're harvesting less than half. And actually, I just found out today with the new numbers, we're actually harvesting even less than that of the net growth in the woods. Then the markets for low-grade wood are evolving. And I'm going to talk about what low-grade wood means in a second. But what I mean by the markets are evolving is traditionally in our region, low-grade wood would have gone to paper mills. That was the major driver for markets. And that's changed. I look at us all sitting together here on Zoom. So in a digital world, the demand for paper has shifted, and shifting markets to advanced wood heat represents a market opportunity to absorb some of that market loss. And that's really what we are here for as a Department of Forest, Parks, and Rec, is it's absolutely essential to have healthy markets for low and high grade wood. And we'll talk about why in a second. Because unfortunately, Vermont is losing a few thousand acres of forest land a year, and it's losing it to rural and suburban development. So when it becomes unaffordable for a landowner to hold on to their forest land, or the economic pressures are such that it makes more sense to develop it than to keep it in forest land, we can lose it to things like this, where we get forest fragmentation and we start to lose all of those forest resources like habitat, water filtration, carbon sequestration, carbon storage. We want to make sure that we see forests stay intact, and having healthy markets in order to help all those private landowners keep their forests the way they are is really an important tool in the toolbox to make that happen. So just to clear up high versus low grade wood, maybe terms you've heard before, maybe not. So high grade wood is also sometimes called saw grade wood. And that's if you buy something at your local lumber yard that might get turned into, a cabinet, a floorboard, a 2x4, something that's worthy putting into a saw. That's high grade wood. And so that's the really high economic value wood that comes out of the forest. And then about 2-to-1, 3-to-1 ratio as part of every harvest is low grade wood. So that's wood that's maybe diseased, crooked, a species that isn't desirable for a saw function. That has traditionally, like I was saying, gone to paper markets, but it can also serve us in displacing fossil fuels instead. So what goes on in the woods exactly? So if you don't live in my world, and to be honest, I grew up in Illinois where we don't really have trees, so I didn't know any of this, growing up. So this was an education for me once I moved to the Northeast. And I think if we all had a better sense of vitamin in the woods, we'd all feel a little bit better about it. So again, please tell your friends. So like I said, Vermont is about 80% privately owned in the forest, and more than half of that is currently enrolled in the use value appraisal program, which is also sometimes referred to as current use or UVA. And part of being enrolled in UVA is that you have to have a forest management plan for the land you have enrolled in order to participate in this tax abatement program. And you develop that forest management plan with a forester. And foresters are college educated, and they have to be certified by the state of Vermont, or sorry, licensed by the state of Vermont. And they will take into account what's important to a landowner when they're putting together that management plan. So they might help them put together a management plan that really prioritizes high value timber, or more often what we see is putting together a management plan that prioritizes wildlife habitat, or carbon sequestration, or recreation, or water quality, but it's almost always wildlife. That is what the plans get put together to prioritize. And then the logger is who actually pulls the trees out according to the forester who has designated exactly what's going to happen. And that happens about every 10 to 30 years, depending on the management plan. And the great thing about wood heat, as opposed to fossil fuel heat, is that it also supports our local economy. So when Vermonters heat with fossil fuels, 78 cents of every dollar spent on fossil fuels leaves the state. But when we heat with locally sourced wood fuels, 80 cents of every dollar actually stays in Vermont. And so recirculates that wealth here locally. Now, Vermont has a couple of goals related to advanced wood heating. The one I think most people are familiar with is the goal to reach 90% renewable energy by the year 2050. But one of the unsung heroes of that goal buried in there is to get to 35% of just our thermal energy needs from wood heat by the year 2030. Now, Vermont is a cold rural place, so our electric, thermal, and transportation sectors are very roughly equal thirds, as opposed to other sectors that are really electric heavy. We have a really high thermal demand. So getting to a much more renewable place with our thermal needs is actually really significant. Now, why 35? we came up with this number very carefully, and we wanted to pick something that was doable and also very responsible for the forest. So in 2010, we did the Vermont Wood Fuel Supply Study, which pretends that Vermont is an island, which of course it's not. And then it looks at all the forest land, and then it eliminates all the forest land that can't be harvested for one reason or another, either because of some legal binding or because of wildlife constraints or wetlands or steep slopes. And then like a little bit more, just take, and then let's be extra conservative on that. And then, okay, so what of that, of the low grade wood growth that's happening on that remaining land that could possibly be harvested, what could we do sustainably just within Vermont to meet our thermal energy needs without sacrificing forest health? And the very conservative estimate was 35%. And we just redid this study in 2019, which I guess is no longer just redid, time is flying. But we found that there's actually 5% more low-grade wood growth in the forest now than there was when we did the study initially. So we could have set a higher goal, but that's okay, because getting a third of our thermal energy needs from wood heat is a great goal, and definitely something that would be hugely impactful. Because if we reach that goal, we would displace 40 million gallons of fossil fuel every year, and estimate that Vermonters would save about $120 million a year.
Yeah.
Right now, Vermont gets about 23% of its thermal energy needs from wood, and 43% of Vermonters heat, at least in part, with wood. Now, 23% sounds pretty close to 35, especially in the scale of like climate goals and energy goals. That sounds pretty good. But that 12 percentage point gap is really the crux of what we're trying to accomplish, because Vermont has such a long and established history of heating with wood. We've been at 23% for quite some time. So that 12 percentage point gap is really where we're going to see change. And a third of Vermont's student body actually attends a school heated with wood. Again, just establishing our really long, strong history as a leader in wood heat. Getting to 35%, we mapped out a few different ways we could get there. And just one possible map of what that could look like would be adding about another 40,000 pellet stoves, 10,000 residential pellet boilers, 2,500 commercial pellet boilers, and about another 200 commercial chip systems. We could get to our goal exclusively with commercial chip systems, or exclusively something else. We feel like this is a reasonable balance and want to make sure that this technology is available to a wide swath of customers. Now, there are three wood fuel types. There's chips on the left, cordwood in the center, of course, what we're all most familiar with, and then pellets on the right. So I'm just going to do an overview of what these are and their different applications. So cord of wood, as I bet most people here know, is a pile of wood that is 4 by 4 by 8 feet of stacked split wood. So named because in the ye old times, it was actually measured with an literal cord. And the pros to cordwood are that it's DIY-able and it's super affordable. The con is that there's so much room for user error, both in terms of how you dry it and how you put it into your appliance. But lots of people use it. I use it. I've got a wood stove in the other room. And over a third of Vermont households heat with cordwood. Again, either is their primary heat or is their second source. Now, when we're talking about advanced wood heat, I just want to be very clear that we're not talking about adding anything that looks like this to the landscape. We want to retire all of these. That bottom left one was in my in-laws house until a couple of years ago. Not this exact photo, but that literal exact same stove. And I finally talked them into replacing it. They've been thanking me ever since. We want to see things like this go in. So when we're talking about advanced cordwood heating, it looks like brand new high performance EPA certified wood stoves and these really high end or high tech rather cordwood boilers. And just a quick note on the fireplace. Be very clear that open fireplaces are not heating appliances. They will actually suck the warm air up and out of your house and produce 30 times the amount of pollution as a wood stove. A wood stove will give you 3 times the amount of heat with 1/3 the amount of wood. Fireplaces as heat sources is just an illusion because it feels really nice when you're close to it, but they're really terrible. Put a wood stove insert in there instead, and everything will be hunky-dory. Okay, great. More heat, less pollution. So wood pellets are made of 100% compressed sawdust, and they look like rabbit food, kind of, because they are made out of a very similar equipment. And they burn very clean, and because they're small and evenly sized, they can run through equipment in a way that's comparable to a liquid fuel. So that's where we can start to see more automated appliances once we get into pellets. And they are sold both bags, like you see this little fellow helping to stack out back, or in loose bulk form. And they can be burned in a pellet stove, which in many ways functions like a wood stove in that it's a space heater and really easy to install in your home. If you don't already have a chimney, a pellet stove is much easier to install because they can be direct vented through an exterior wall. So that adds some more flexibility and affordability when installing them. They can also be burned in a pellet boiler or pellet furnace. This is where things start to get really exciting in terms of automation and really having a one-for-one replacement option for your oil boiler, your propane boiler, or whatever you might have. Now, this is a diagram of what it looks like to heat with wood pellets. And when I walk through this should sound remarkably familiar because it is just like heating with a propane boiler or an oil boiler, and that a delivery truck will pull up to your home and they will deposit pellets in your storage facility. This is a picture from Austria where there is actually such a thing as a pellet storage room. If you don't have one, that's fine. There are interior and exterior storage options that can work for really any home, depending on what your setup is. And then you turn the thermostat, pellets are fed to your boiler, and then you have hot water or hot air, depending on your setup. That's it. There is bulk pellet delivery available throughout the state of Vermont. We've even seen a couple of companies, including Bournes and Sandry, that are traditional fossil fuel companies that have decided to also add bulk pellet delivery to their portfolio as they see green energy as the future. The last wood fuel type is wood chips, and wood chips are a very affordable fuel because they are not processed much at all. They pretty much go straight from the woods to the end user. They just go through a chipper on the way. They have a high upfront cost though, because they are not processed. They are a green wood chip. They can freeze into a useless lump if left outside. So they have a high capex for installation because they have some sort of indoor storage to keep them warm. This is the National Life building in Montpelier where my offices are. But for large scale buildings like National Life or high schools or hospitals, that high capex can be totally worth it because the fuel itself is so affordable. There is a new cool option that is coming to be more and more available now though, called a dry chip. So that's sort of a hybrid option between a pellet and a green chip where it's been dried enough that it can be stored outdoors in a silo like pellet, which really brings down the installation cost of the equipment while still being less expensive than a pellet. So that's kind of a nice hybrid option. So the upfront cost for a pellet boiler or a pellet stove, and I will caution you that this is before any sort of incentives or tax rebates or anything at all. For a pellet boiler, about 18 to 20,000, little less for a pellet furnace. And pellet stove can be 3,000 to 4,000 installed, wood stove 2,000 to 3,000 installed, assuming you already have a chimney. If not, you'll need to figure in that cost. And then wood chip boilers cost a lot. It's a whole other thing. And but it makes sense for a large scale system with a proper feasibility study. So the current residential incentives, I'd say possibly the most important one here is the tax credit, and this passed at the very end of 2020. So there's a 26% federal tax credit for all residential wood heating devices that have at least 75% efficiency. And that includes not only the appliance itself, but everything needed to make that function. So that includes your labor, that includes the taxes on it, that includes, a heat pad under a wood stove, anything else that's absolutely essential to making that appliance function is something that you can take that 26% off of. So then on top of that, if you were getting a pellet boiler and a furnace, there's $3,000 from the Clean Energy Development Fund, which you access through Efficiency Vermont, who themselves also have a $3,000 rebate. And then depending on your utility, and I doubt there's anyone in WEC territory on this particular Zoom, but some of the utilities do have additional rebates available. If you have a larger system, it can be custom rebates available through Efficiency Vermont, and these are sales tax exempt. For stoves, there's a trade-in rebate of $500 available from Efficiency Vermont. Hopefully Bill's not going to tell me I screwed up the number, but I think it's 500. And then again, there's additional rebates available from some of the utilities. There are financing options. There's all the traditional financing options like home equity loans, but really the most exciting one is the Heat Saver Loan product, which is through VSECU and Efficiency Vermont. And it's an income-based interest rates, but they go as low as 0%. And you can use them for stoves, which makes stoves extra affordable. If you need to put in a new pellet stove and finance it, you can be looking at something like a $20, $30 a month payment. So really good to have in your pocket and to be able to share with folks. If you need to suddenly replace a stove or something, it's really nice to know that this option is available. And it's a loan product that has also purposefully been designed to be readily accessible and more easily accessible than other loans that require liens and more burdensome applications. So definitely check that out. So the next burning question is, will I save money if I do this? And the answer is yeah, but how exactly will your ROI be? That's an impossible question to answer because wood fuel prices are lower and more stable, which I'll show you on the next slide, than fossil fuels. But your ROI would determine whatever the current price of oil is. So you might get an ROI of 3 years, or it might be 20, just depending on what the current price of oil is and what the incentives were at the time you made your investment. So if this is what I refer to as my squiggly line slide. And if you can't quite read it, it's okay, although it's actually helpful that we all have screens now when it's supposed to me presenting this at the front of a room. So that very top line is electric resistance heating. So that's your most expensive option. And then the orange and blue ones that look like mountains in the middle, that's propane and fuel oil. So you can see that sometimes they're real cheap, but mostly they're just hugely unpredictable and highly volatile. And right now propane is through the roof. And then down there at the bottom, just sort of chugging along with the price of inflation, we have all of the wood fuels, cold climate heat pumps, and natural gas. So I'm going to transition to talking about some of the, what about this type questions that I usually get. So I'll try to head them off here. The first question I usually get is about PM emissions. So PM stands for particulate matter. Wood burning produces emissions of fine particulate matter, which is harmful to human health, but is no longer the concern that it was years ago because we've gotten so much better at heating with wood. Older wood stoves and outdoor wood boilers, specifically older outdoor wood boilers, can be a significant source of PM emissions, and that is a problematic and something that we would like to see them changed out for newer models. And for larger installations, there are air pollution control devices that can be installed to really make them very impressively clean burning. And just to show you one comparative chart, on the right there, you can see the PM emissions of an old non-EPA certified wood stove. So that would be about pre-1990 or earlier, or an outdoor boiler. And then if you just go down to a now EPA certified stove, we see about a 70% drop in PM emissions. And then you get even cleaner as you go down to a pellet stove. And you can see where pellet boilers, propane boilers, and oil boilers are really quite on parity with their emissions. And, you know, I mentioned trade out programs there briefly, and this is why it's really important, right? Because we want to install a heck of a lot of new advanced wood heating systems. I think this is a really great visual where for every one old non-EPA certified wood stove that we pull out, we could put in 200 pellet boilers. So that have maintained net the same amount of PM emissions. Or if you think about that differently, if we pull out one old stove, just for every 100 pellet boilers we put in, we can have a net reduction in the total amount of PM in our air. So really important to change out those older non-performing models as we do this as well. And just to illustrate again how far we've come in the past 30 years. So this shows you how much the efficiency of advanced wood heating has come along since 1980, and how the carbon monoxide emissions have dropped during that same period. So the engineering on these is really completely different than, you know, your grandfather's wood stove. All right, I'm going to just to the next what about this question, which is about climate change and about carbon. And I'll start with this quote from the IPCC, which says, in the long term, a sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining or increasing forest carbon stocks while producing an annual sustained yield of timber, fiber, or energy from the forest will generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit. So what that's saying is that this is a yes and situation. We need to keep forests as forests, and we need to use advanced wood heat in order to meet our climate goals. This is all hands on deck. Keep forests as forests, displace fossil fuels, use advanced wood heat, keep it going, do all the things. And this is a quote from a paper called Forest Carbon, which I really liked and would really recommend to folks, especially folks who aren't foresters, because it was written with a landowner audience in mind. So it's much more readable than some of the more technical publications. And I really like this quote in it, which is, keeping forests as forests is the single most important action any forest owner can do to maintain forest carbon sequestration and storage, reducing the impact of climate change. So this just gets back to what I was saying before about, you know, the reason FPR is in this game at all is to keep forests as forests, full stop. And advanced wood heat is part of that, and displacing fossil fuels, it's awesome, even better. And just some of you may be familiar with this concept, or this might be new for some of you, but I really like this graph of illustrating the difference between geologic carbon and biogenic carbon. Ultimately, the atmosphere doesn't know the difference, but I think it's a helpful exercise to at least appreciate this for ourselves. It just, the geologic carbon is oil, it's decayed dinosaurs, it's things that were previously happily stored beneath the Earth's surface that we've now pulled into the atmosphere and created a problem. Had we never discovered fossil fuels and just been using wood fuels and other biogenic sources that were already circulating in the atmosphere, we wouldn't be in this pickle. But because we've created this externality of geologic carbon, we have the issue at hand. And to compare wood fuels as to other heating fuels in terms of their carbon emissions, Now, we wouldn't say that wood fuels are carbon neutral. It is still carbon, but it is dramatically carbon better than all of the fossil fuel options, with these added benefits of forest health and economics for Vermont. So keeping those dollars local. I'll just let this one sit for a second if you want to read. All right, I was cruising, so I'm going to take us through fun exercise I wasn't sure we would have time for. These people are real, but this is a hypothetical scenario that I'm going to take you through. Or this is the Smith family. And maybe you guys are in a similar situation as the Smiths, where they have a 2,500 square foot home that was built in the 90s. They have an oil boiler that is coming to the end of its life. They're not in an emergency situation, but it's getting up and they're like, woohoo, time. We finally get to make a change. They really like renewables. They already have a Tesla Model 3. They go to Florida every winter in it. Their house is not a passive house. It's not high performance, but there's nothing super red flag terrible about it either. And we would assume about 30,000 BTUs per square foot per year for their use, which if that's just like very average, very normal, no red flags, right? But not super impressive, not super terrible. That's where they're at. And so they're trying to decide what they ought to do next. Should they go with heat pumps or should they go with pellets when they replace their oil? And this is a shortened version of a longer presentation that I gave. So I'm just going to cut to the financial chase, but I'm very happy to talk through all the other decision points that they went through as well. But they compared all of their options, and their options were to keep their oil boiler, which they obviously don't want to do. It's at the end of its life. They'll have to get rid of it. They could replace it with heat pumps. So they could replace it with a multi-head heat pump option. They could replace it with a pellet boiler. They could replace it with a hybrid system, which would be heat pumps and a pellet stove. Or they could replace it with a propane boiler. So they considered all their options, where they have their installation costs there, which are not so far apart from each other. And then you have your approximate annual fuel cost of what they might do. And then they're considering what they ought to do. And the important thing to think about is, so the heat pumps will give them air conditioning, but their house is okay, but it's not super tight. So they're a little bit worried about what might happen if they're in Florida in January and it gets really, really cold and the heat pumps can't keep up. The hybrid option helps if they're home, because the pellet stove can take over for the heat pumps when they're home. And then the propane option will obviously work. It'll keep their house warm all the time, as will the pellet boiler. So they're trying to decide what they want to do. The heat pumps would also give them air conditioning. So that's a nice perk. So they can decide what they want to do next. You guys can type it in the chat or not. This was a poll option I had here from a presentation version where we had a in-webinar polling tool. So you can just think it to yourselves which one you would vote for. And it won't surprise you to discover that they went with the pellet boiler. And they did that because they really wanted to have that even heat distribution of a central heating system that is a boiler, as opposed to heat pumps, the wall mount heat pumps that they would have been going with, which are effectively space heaters. They know they can rest comfortably when they're in Florida, knowing that their house will stay warm no matter what the temperature drops to, because they're completely off fossil fuels. And they like that it helps to keep forests as forests, and it really just made economic sense for them. And I will say that the hybrid option of putting in heat pumps and a pellet stove can be a really nice symbiotic option when it makes sense. And when that makes sense is in the situation where A, you have a home that could rely solely on its heat pumps, but would save a whole lot of kilowatt hours and add a lot of ambiance if you had a stove. Or if you have a home that has a fossil fuel system that has a lot of life left in it. I can see that my face is frozen. Can you still hear me? Oh, here we go. I'm back. Or if you have a fossil fuel boiler that still has a lot of life left in it, but you still want to go ahead and make a transition to a renewable, adding a pellet stove can easily take on 75% of your heating needs on the days that you're home with much less effort than a wood stove. So that can be a nice bridge option to go ahead and displace a lot of the fossil fuels in your home without committing to taking out your perfectly good fossil fuel system. So the next step, if you want to proceed, is to talk to an expert. So if you're interested in a wood stove or a pellet stove, you would go to your local stove shop and consult an expert there. For a pellet boiler, there's a list of installers on Efficiency Vermont's website. And for a large scale chip system, that's when you'd really need a feasibility study. You can talk to me and I'll point you in the right direction. But you can feel really good about heating with wood because those three main takeaways. One, keeps energy dollars local. Two, displaces fossil fuels. And three, most importantly, it keeps forest as forest. Thank you. All right, that was a whirlwind. I added slides for you guys because I thought you were special. So feel free to ask me to speak more broadly to any topics that we covered.
Well, Emma, we did have a question in the chat about the heating efficiency metric for that tax credit. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah. I'm a little curious if the question asker wants to elaborate, if they're interested in a stove or a boiler, just so I can more tailor my answer. But I'll start talking until we get more information. So it is 75% HHV, which is high heating value. And you can find out what stoves are eligible by going to the EPA wood heater database online, and you can sort by 75% efficiency or greater. All of the wood pellet boilers from the major manufacturers qualify.
Well, we did have a couple other comments that I think I can turn into a question.
Okay.
It may not be something that you know about, but home insurance difficulties. Have you run into to problems with home insurance, and do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, you know, when we hear about this, which it comes up from time to time, it is. Well, again, it's the question is sort of like, we're talking about a stove or a boiler. So the previously insurance companies, when pellet boilers first started coming online, were a little confused what to make of the situation. But they have now all been really quite educated to the fact that they are complete one-for-one replacements for an oil or propane boiler. Because really what insurance companies' concern is not that it's a wood heating appliance, it's that your pipes will freeze. And so if they're used to a world where, you know, wood stoves, pellet stoves, those go out after a day or two. And if you're not home, then your pipes will freeze if that is your main heating source. And part of how you receive the Vermont incentives for a pellet boiler is you have to install a system that can store at least 2 weeks worth of fuel to get at this issue precisely. If you are installing a wood stove or a pellet stove, you will have to have some sort of backup option that can keep heating your house even after the stove goes out, again, for the pipes freezing issue.
And just talking about the pipes freezing issue, Emma, is it correct that any automated system, you still have to have some sort of electricity because it's actually set on a thermostat? So thinking
Sure,
about,
yeah. every heating appliance ever, except for wood stoves, requires electricity. So whether you're talking about an oil boiler, a propane boiler, what it is, you have to have electricity except for a wood stove. And like 3 pellet stoves.
And I have another low grade wood question for you. You said there's kind of, the foresters go out and look at if it's low or high grade. I mean, if one was to be clearing their own kind of forests, is there a certain like size of tree that they need or a certain species? Or can they, collect sticks and twigs and turn it into wood chips or pellets through some sort of company? Or is that not an option?
That's not really an option.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, you need, chips are not a complicated product, but they do require some level of equipment and scale that it wouldn't make sense for anyone to do by themselves. Yeah, if you're doing your own firewood, I would just stick to what looks good for the stove. But if you're talking about doing something on the scale of chips or pellets, you would inevitably be working with a professional.
Wait a minute, are you planning on hanging around?
What do you mean?
I didn't know if we wanted to let Bill talk and then we open up for more Q&A or.
Yeah, Bill wasn't planning on giving a particular presentation. He's
Okay.
just going to take Q&As as appropriate, but.
Sure, and I think we're probably at that point.
Great. Okay. Well, I had a couple questions, and while others throw it in there, one of my questions was: is there any particular regulation or maybe incentive for the wood to come from Vermont right now? Because I think that's a concern that I continue to get. Is that the point of this is to build the wood market, but how do we kind of guarantee that the wood is coming from Vermont?
No. And that's okay. And I'll explain why. So for firewood and wood chips, those are both high volume, low cost products. But frankly, it just doesn't make any sense to move them very far. So if you're heating with either firewood or chips, you can rest assured they're local or someone lost a lot of money, because that just doesn't make sense. For pellets, we have one pellet mill in Vermont. That's Vermont Wood Pellet in Clarendon. And they don't make anywhere close to enough pellets to meet Vermont's current demand for pellets. And that's okay. And that is okay because there are also pellet mills in New York, New Hampshire, Maine, and Quebec. So still in our northern forest region that have plenty of capacity for our current needs and our needs if we were to, grow and meet this 35% by 30 goal. And the low grade wood market is a regional market and always has been, even with paper or with wood heat. And so it's sort of a raise all ship situation. If the low grade wood market is terrible here, that's terrible everywhere. And so if we are able to increase demand in general, it helps all of us. And also in general, there's a pellet mill right across the river in New Hampshire, and certainly plenty of Vermont logs cross the river and then come back over in the form of pellets. So where exactly it's coming from, it's okay if in this case for local to be regional and for that to be appropriate. Certainly we'd love to see another pellet mill come online, and a lot of people would. So, but in the meantime, I'm not losing sleep over the pellets coming from New Hampshire.
I didn't see any other questions yet, so I'll ask another one. Another important question I feel like I get all the time is, where does weatherization fit in here?
Bill, I feel like you want that one.
Thanks. I do, and I think that question is also associated with the question we are often asked and think a lot about, balancing the change to renewable heat with electrification. If a building is super tight or easily weatherized to a really tight shell with high R values, it's the option to electrify that heating system is much simpler. Weatherization is a very expensive process, and so really I think it's good to do, obviously, but is it cost effective in the long run? That's kind of the question. And I will say that we do want to be efficient with our wood heat. But if you can't button up a 200-year-old home to near passive house and install a couple mini splits to achieve the heating capacity you need, then wood is probably a better option. I hope that sheds some light on the question. I know it didn't answer it directly, but I wonder if you have any follow-ups there, or maybe a more specific case that I could kind of address in that sense.
No, I think that was spot on. I think that's usually, if we're going back to the Smiths hypothetical, they had kind of probably an okay R value. If they were, if they had massive leaks and we're still looking at the same option, would it change if they then, if it was, well, we have to go do, we have to spend 10,000 on weatherization. How could that possibly change their thoughts? Do they stick with the oil furnace for longer until it actually dies? Does that put them in a worse situation later? So it's always just trying to really find that balance.
It is a balancing act, and when it's not possible to weatherize, well, I guess I'll back up and I'll say that you can drop a pellet boiler in that is the same capacity as your existing oil or propane boiler with no ill effects. You might still be wasting some of that heat, and it's worthwhile to weatherize as you can, but if it's cost prohibitive to weatherize the entire thing, you now are burning and I guess wasting some of renewable fuel, but at least it's renewable fuel, and it's also cheaper renewable fuel. So really, if you choose to not weatherize, it's even more cost effective to burn pellets as opposed to fuel oil. But we obviously always recommend weatherizing as you can.
I just have a sort of follow-up question related to kind of that discussion. You both tend to use boiler a lot. I mean, could we assume that that is synonymous with a wood pellet furnace as well?
Yeah.
Kind of one in one.
Most people seem to have, the majority of people seem to have boilers. So I just tend to say it because boiler and furnace just is a lot of words to say. But yes, there are pellet boilers and there are pellet furnaces, and both can be fully automated.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Carrie had a question. Are there any special requirements in the disposal of pellet ash as it is a manufactured product? No, it's just 100% sawdust. There's nothing else in it.
And taking your ash out of your pellet boiler is like a joy compared to emptying your wood stove. There's a suitcase, what looks like a suitcase attached to a pellet boiler, and that's where the ash goes, and you pick up the suitcase, or briefcase really, is still in a suitcase. It would fit under the seat in front of you. And then you take it outside, open up your briefcase, dump it on your lawn or your compost, wherever, and then you close your briefcase and put it back on your pellet boiler. Which is considerably simpler than what I do with my wood stove.
So, seeing no others, I have kind of another high level hypothetical, and that's more aimed at that 35%. Because if we were to hit that target with the much more efficient systems, overall, comparing that to if we were to just stay right where we are over the next 10 years, I mean, do you see that we're cutting down more trees, or we're probably just able to heat more homes with the same amount of fuel?
We aren't cutting down more trees because, well, I guess I sort of hesitate to use the word tree because there's sort of we need to see the forest through the trees thing we need to consider here. So we wouldn't be losing any forest land. As the actual sticks, or I don't want to necessarily get into that, but as efficiency increases, you're right. We can heat more homes with the same amount of wood, 100%. And then the other factor that is, as the destination for low-grade wood shifts, we aren't necessarily harvesting anymore. We're just changing where we're sending it, right? So instead of creating paper, we're creating wood fuels. So yes, we'd be using more wood for wood fuels, but that doesn't necessarily mean how much we're harvesting is changing at all.
Great. I think that helps, because kind of one of those myths that I feel like gets thrown around is the harvest is going to continue to, the harvest is going to increase if we have more heating, or if we have more wood stoves.
Right. The thing is, like, even with more demand for wood heat, no forester no longer would ever go out and form a harvest just for wood fuels, because they're so low value that you have to be doing a big picture harvest management as part of your harvest management plan. And really it's just like, what can we do with this low economic value stuff? Like, it would be, no one ever would go out just to harvest wood to make pellets, or just to harvest to make chips. That's more like, okay, we did the high economic value stuff that's going to the sawmill. As part of that, and as part of carrying out this management plan in a healthy way for the forest, I also have all this other stuff. What can I do with it?
Could I add on to that question? And maybe thinking about it from another perspective, the net growth of forests I guess, am I right in thinking that the net growth of forests in Vermont is sequestering enough carbon to support an increase in wood biomass heating to that 35%? There's enough BTUs already being sequestered, net positive sequestration, that we could extract more and still stay net positive in sequestration. Is that correct?
You're in BTUs and carbon, and you lost me in unit of measurements of carbon.
So currently there is a net growth of forests and sequestration in Vermont forests.
Mm-hmm.
IPCC suggests that as long as that stays positive, we can harvest that wood as fuel to displace fossil fuel consumption.
Mhm.
I would assume that the 35% goal for wood heat in the state is taking, it's 35% of the BTUs used in homes, assigning it to that woody fuel. And I'm saying there's still enough net growth in the state to support that number of BTUs and have positive sequestration in Vermont's forests, excuse me.
Yes. I said the answer is yes. I'll say that the goal to meet 35 by 30 was not a carbon-based goal. It was a BTU-based goal and a forest health-based goal with like, did not take carbon into account at all. It was like strictly forest health, renewability. Will the forest be good? Not, the forest doesn't really care how much carbon it has in it, right? The forest doesn't know. We know, and that's really important. But we were like, okay, will the forest still be in good shape? Yes. So that is where that goal came from. To answer your question about carbon, this is where I kind of want to like defer you to my forest carbon colleague, Dr. Ali Kasiba. She can speak to this way more specifically than I can. But the short version is that it is absolutely possible to manage the same parcel for both carbon sequestration, carbon storage, and harvest for timber and fuels. And it's possible to do all those things on the same place. And not everyone will do all those things. You might prioritize one and another, and that's okay. But yes, absolutely, there's plenty of capacity. And it's really, we can get in the weeds real fast, but it is really interesting to think about too, because younger trees sequester carbon more quickly. Older trees store more carbon just because they're physically larger, and finding the happy mix of all of those things while also maintaining all these other wonderful resources forests have for us, like wildlife habitat. And wildlife habitat really requires having young growth, and you can't have young growth without cutting down old growth, and all these other factors that go in. But with the big picture being no net loss of forest, yes, is the answer to your question.
Alex, are you seeing any other questions?
No, I was just scanning the chat and I don't see any further. The original high heat value question suggested that EPA is standard to be less stringent than some states' requirements. I used Washington State's list to access higher efficiency products. So I'm not, I mean, that's not a question, but.
Jeff, do you happen to still be on? If you want to elaborate on that question.
Yeah, it was kind of back to the efficiency rating. I've been familiar with the EPA's list in the past, and I thought it was a measure of particulate matter as opposed to combustion efficiency, although I guess they're kind of similar.
Right. No, you're not wrong at all. So yes, EPA certification is based on particulate matter, but on the wood heater database, a filter where you can slide it over and just filter so it only shows the stoves and other wood heaters that have an efficiency of 75% or more. There are, because you asked, I'm going to tell you the whole thing, which is that so new EPA regs in 2020 changed it so that the new stove limits was 2.0 PM per hour. So all of the stove manufacturers retooled their stoves to meet the new EPA regs of 2020 of 2.0 PM per hour or less. And then completely separate from that process, the BTU Act, which is the 26% tax credit, passed at the end of 2020. And that was an efficiency-based tax credit, nothing to do with PM. And so there are a heck of a lot of really good stoves on the market that are certified with like 72% efficiency, which is a darn shame, because had they known, they totally could have retooled for 75% efficiency. So I would say, it's hard to pass up a 26% tax credit. I feel that I'm in the market for a new stove myself for a new house that we're moving into. But there are lots and lots of other very good stoves that are EPA certified that don't meet the tax credit. So it is worth still considering those if one of those might actually be a better fit for your setup.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Another question, we talked about the passive houses were mentioned. How well can biomass fit when they're very low heating load in the home? Is there equipment out there now that's really appropriate for that? I do have passive house training and
Oh, nice.
first not certification, the training,
Cool.
but the so many times people are trying to talk folks out of wood heat because
Yep.
it's unnecessary and it's going to overheat their home.
Yep.
And that's in part
I totally
due to the
understand, because
output
the
of
house
product.
I'm building is a passive house with a lowercase p. And yeah, figuring out how to heat a low load home isn't easy. It's been quite the education. There are wood heating options for really low load homes. Myself and a couple of Bill colleagues gave a talk on this a couple of years ago at the Better Building Design Conference, and I think you can access that presentation online. There are very small stoves. You do usually have to have a direct air intake. Often that makes the most sense, is to do a very small stove with a direct air intake and a heat pump. And there are also very small pellet boilers, although those are harder to acquire and are less likely to make sense. But they are an option if you have like a very large passive home that might just have enough load for that to be viable. But usually a heat pump and a very small stove.
Well, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Stephen, I guess I would just open it up. If anybody wants to shout out any questions, go for it. But, I think in respect of everybody's time, if there's no more questions, we're set. So we'll give it a couple minutes. Anybody else? Raise a hand, come off mute.
I will ask Bill. I don't know if you can see the chat. Kerry Kennedy was swayed by this and said that he was looking to switch from a fuel oil boiler to a pellet boiler, and I referred him to Efficiency Vermont to look at contractors. He said there was only one contractor in the search in Winooski. Do you know of any in southern Vermont?
Yes. I don't know if he's still on. I'm not sure where he's looking on the efficiency.
Thanks. I know that Pellergy is out of Montpelier, and they are, I believe, a pellet boiler supplier and installer. I am still here, but it is nearly bedtime for Felix, so I'm doing double duty.
That's fair.
But I can dig deeper also and try to get you a broader list. Are you looking for an installer specifically, or a supplier, or both?
Carrie, most of the sellers will travel pretty far afield. I know Lime Green Heat, they're based out of Lyme, New Hampshire, so they'd be closer to you, and I know they do work in Southern Vermont. So I'd broaden your search. Most of the pellet boilers are willing to make a drive.
There's also Froling out of Keene, New Hampshire. That isn't too far if you're on the eastern side of the state.
Isn't there a pellet supplier and probably contractor in Dorset or Manchester?
I think that's maybe
I
a
thought you had
satellite of
pictures of-
Pellergy.
Yeah, I thought I saw a truck that was from Southern Vermont, at least that part of the state.
Yeah, I'm just gonna find the list for you. Hang on. Yeah, you can go Sunwood Biomass, Lime Green Heat, Tarn Biomass. The Froling Energy is a little bit confusing because they are actually a wood chip manufacturer and install wood chips. And then there are also Froling pellet boilers, so that gets real confusing because they're not actually Froling dealers. But yeah, here we go. Okay, there you go. Now everyone just has the list.
Thanks, Emma.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Sandry, they'd be down near you. They're out of Mass, but that's not too far from you guys.
Hey. Well, Bill will let you get to bedtime. I'm shortly behind you. Emma, thank you so much for both of you coming. Alex, I'll let you close it out.
Yes, again, to repeat, Stephen, we appreciate you bringing this presentation and answering questions and spreading some knowledge. So
Yeah, absolutely.
much
Okay.
appreciated.
Happy to. Have a good night.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Too.